Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mely Anthony. I am your chairperson for today's seminar. We would like to welcome everyone to a very interesting and timely topic entitled The Science, Politics, and Geopolitics of COVID-19 Vaccine. You would agree that this is a timely topic because just this week we have seen the first delivery of the COVID-19 to the UK and to the US. And as announced yesterday by the Singapore government, we here in Singapore would be expecting the first approved vaccine from Pfizer BioNTech to reach us here by the end of 2020. It is a very welcome, much awaited development as the world continues to grapple, almost a year now, with stopping the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some experts have now declared a light at the end of the tunnel or the beginning of an end to this horrendous disease that has upended our lives. Yet, as we all know, the road ahead remains bumpy. Hence, we are indeed delighted to welcome Dr. Khor Swee Kheng to share with us his thoughts on the challenges facing vaccine, access, distribution, and equity, among others. Very briefly, allow me to introduce Dr. Khor Swee Kheng. He is a Malaysian physician with an international experience in the public, private, and nonprofit academic and think tank sectors. Currently, he is an independent consultant for the World Health Organization and holds visiting fellowships at the United Nations University Institute, International Institute for Global Health and ISIS Malaysia. Previously, he has held senior roles in 4 practice areas of clinical medicine, refugee and disaster relief, clinical research, and pharma. He has been based in Malaysia and many other places, Singapore, Dubai, Shanghai, Paris, among others. He holds postgraduate degrees in internal medicine, public health, and public policy. So without further ado, may I now call on Dr. Khor Swee Kheng to speak to us. And over to you, Swee Kheng.
Thank you, Mely. It's a pleasure to be here. And while we wait for the slides to come out by my colleagues in NTU, thank you very much, Joey. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here to speak with you on a very, very timely topic. What we'd like to do today is to go as broad as possible in the vaccine landscape and then to zoom into questions and answers upon your, say, interactions in about half an hour from now. Joey, would you please move to the next slide? I'd like to begin with a few disclosures. I declare no conflicts. The opinions currently are my own. Mely's provided a very generous and very kind introduction. I may just add one more note is that the diverse experiences that I've had over the last 15, 16 years or so in various countries gives me a little bit of a generalist's viewpoint about the COVID-19 vaccine. And as you might imagine, what we will do is to begin the science and then move on to the politics and the geopolitics of it, because this is more than just a scientific endeavor. Indeed, the COVID vaccination program will probably be the most important global logistics and mobilization program that requires all of government and all of society all at once. Therefore, the agenda, if I may, is to go as follows. The first part of the presentation will be a 30-minute lecture where I will give you as broad as possible the vaccine landscape from the scientific, political, and geopolitical perspective. We will aim for breadth and not depth. I will also be describing rather than prescribing anything during the first part of it for the first 30 minutes. But in the second part, in the Q&A portion, which I hope to spend 60 minutes together with you, we will go a little bit deeper in this time to choose depth over breadth, and to have perhaps more prescriptions than this descriptions. Ladies and gentlemen, let us proceed. The next slide, please, Joey. Joey, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this particular slide is a slide that captures the entire COVID vaccine landscape. There is a lot of material over here. Each of these bullet points requires a PhD or years and years of research. So what we will do is to break it into 10 minutes of science and 10 minutes of politics and 10 minutes of geopolitics. And science, politics, and geopolitics will have one slide each. And then at the end of it, we'll return to this broad COVID landscape. And then maybe we'll pick out a few themes that might be very relevant, and also move on very quickly into the Q&A section. So this one slide over here will be divided into 3 slides, and I wanted to take you through 10 minutes of science, 10 minutes of politics, and 10 minutes of geopolitics. But you can see here, ladies and gentlemen, that there is also divided into 3 components. The first one is the context, where we begin with some, say, background information about the science and the politics and the geopolitics. We'll move on very rapidly to the sharp elements of today's dilemmas, and then to move on to the big picture. And that's a sequence that we will carry for each of these 3 themes. And we'll return to this one slide at the end of 30 minutes. Joey, if you please move to the next slide. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin with the science of the COVID vaccine. The context of the first context I'd like to provide is that this is a triumph of science. The mRNA or messenger RNA vaccines that we've had in the last 1 year meant that humanity was able to mobilize 10 years worth of research into 1 year. How do we do this? Broadly speaking, the science is very good, as in science is more advanced today than ever before. We've got a lot of money in the game, and lots of financing from the government side, from the private sector side, even private capital, as well as philanthropy, is backed by a significant political will. And one crucial instrument is market guarantees, or rather the advanced purchase commitments that have been made by various countries. And that gives a lot of reassurance to companies to plow in more investment. This is how we compressed 10 years essentially for one vaccine into a short period of time. There are some limitations. If I move on to the second point in the triumph of science, no trial will ever be perfect. So let's zoom in a little bit into the Pfizer trial. At the moment, it's only 3 months data, but this 3 months is actually for 40,000 subjects over a minimum 2-month period, and some data extends to 3 months. We don't have any long-term data, but that's because we haven't really been collecting this information at the moment. There is also one more limitation of the current Pfizer trial, in that it perhaps does not mirror real-life conditions. There are 2 arms in the Pfizer trial, about 18,000 participants each. In the arm that did not receive the Pfizer vaccine, they recorded 162 cases in 36,000 patient months of follow-up. What I mean to say is 36,000 subjects were followed up over 1 month each, or you can consider 1,000 patients followed up for 36 months each. And 162 cases seems very low, especially because the cases in America, in Argentina, and in Brazil, where this Pfizer trial took place, seems quite high as well. So this is a snapshot of the limitations of the trials at the moment. And I'll come to that theme again later when we talk about the politics of the approval process. I'll put one more data pointer for everyone to consider. We have approximately 90 to 100 vaccine trials at the moment, and that's beautiful to watch. What's more important for us to consider is that there could be a supply chain over-reliance on the active ingredients in mRNA vaccines. So it's great that Pfizer and Moderna and Sinovac and Sinopharm will have all their vaccines ready, but there's also a supply chain that leads up to the Pfizer factory. So for example, there's a company called Aequitas based in Canada that supplies the lipid shell. It is the fat covering that enables the mRNA to be inserted into, and Aequitas provides a lipid shell to Pfizer, CureVac, and also to the Imperial College trials as well. So although this is a triumph of science, there are still, shall we say, some small inefficiencies or weaknesses in the supply chain that requires us to be thoughtful about as well. Let's move on to the item in yellow in the middle of the screen, which are the dilemmas that we face today. Vaccine delivery will probably take 2 to 5 years for the entire world. The ideal vaccine is 1 dose, like the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that's currently under trial, instead of 2 doses. It's on stable temperatures, for example, 2 to 8 Celsius instead of -70 Celsius, and oral delivery, for example, for the oral polio vaccine. To get there will take some time, but I think that this is a good ideal for us to aspire to. The first generation vaccine, or I put here as 1G, prevents disease and severe disease for approximately 3 months from dose 1. But what can the second generation and the third generation vaccines do? So at the moment, as countries consider how to deliver the vaccine, I move on to the third point on the screen, which is the current annual number of vaccinations is a rough guide for the infrastructure gaps for COVID-19 vaccinations. So for example, in Malaysia, where there are approximately 500,000 live births per year, then you can multiply that by the number of immunizations or rather vaccines inside the National Immunization Program. It gives you a number of approximately 8 to 9 million immunization shots per year. But if Malaysia were to try to vaccinate 70% of our population, that's instead of 8 million shots per year, we're talking 22, 24 million shots a year. And that implies a 3x increase in the infrastructure that we have to build and deliver in order to deliver the vaccines today. Well, obviously, in point number 4, we need a new cold chain infrastructure, even if we do have freezers in the capital cities and university laboratories for -70°C. Some vaccines will probably still need to travel at 2 to 8°C into the rural parts of Southeast Asia, rural parts of Asia, rural parts of Africa, and South Asia as well. So when you consider all these things, you may need a new cold chain infrastructure. And finally, to deliver the vaccine for 2 to 5 years, although there is some health systems and science attached to it, healthcare providers and facilities support, doctors, nurses, clinics, and hospitals are crucial. Unfortunately, we received news that in the United Kingdom, some GP practices or general practitioners have opted out of the NHS vaccination program, citing constraints of bandwidth, meaning they don't have enough time to deliver the vaccines. And if they do deliver the vaccines, they'll be compromising routine patient care for diabetes and hypertension and routine surgeries. So the vaccine logistics is one thing, but the system in which you deliver the vaccines are also very important. For example, doctors, nurses, clinics, and the cold chain infrastructure that's needed for you. Those are the dilemmas in the science element today. But let's move on to the big picture in green on the right-hand side of the screen. And I say this is vaccinating the future. Vaccinating the future because even though, for example, Singapore might receive the first batches of Pfizer's vaccine before the end of 2020, to vaccinate a population of 5 million appears easy. But we have 100 million Vietnamese, 108 million Filipinos, 65 million Thais, 250 million Indonesians. That requires 2 to 3 to 4 years of a program for us to vaccinate enough of the population to try to achieve herd immunity. So I bring forward a few points for you. The first point over here on the right-hand side of the screen is, can a second generation vaccine prevent transmission? The first generation one that we have today, Pfizer, prevents infection. So you can still transmit the infection to somebody else. It just prevents disease in you. So can a second generation vaccine prevent transmission? Can a third generation vaccine have ultra long-term efficacy? However you define ultra long-term, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. And thirdly, we have poly vaccines, for example. DPT is an example of a poly vaccine with multiple vaccines into one vaccine, therefore needing only one shot. Can we, for example, consider the merger of a vaccine for COVID or multiple strains of COVID, or perhaps with the annual flu vaccination? And this requires us to consider whether or not COVID-19 will actually be endemic. And this is the future vaccinations. Now, obviously, when you have 2G, 3G poly vaccines in the picture, assuming it takes 3 years to vaccinate Malaysia, for example, that will bring us to 2023, 2024. What do we then do when the 2G or 3G vaccines are released in 2022? Do we then change our vaccination strategy? What do we do with the purchases that we've signed in 2021, for example? And all these implications on the downstream for how the science might affect the strategy in the long term. And I would add on a note of caution over here, that until we have a full herd immunity, assuming that herd immunity remains possible, thank you, Joey, for going back to the previous slide. Assuming herd immunity is even possible, non-pharmaceutical interventions will remain crucial. Things like contact tracing, adequate testing, rapid turnaround of testing time, some form of targeted movement restrictions, either you call them circuit breakers in Singapore or MCOs in Malaysia. Non-pharmaceutical interventions can be at a low level. It's been proven to be more successful or equally successful to very strict restrictions. And finally, in the big picture, vaccines are only one component of COVID-19 technology. The ACT accelerator, the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, is a very new invention. Around April this year, it was announced by various entities. It includes COVID testing, COVID treatments, and a health system connector. And if I drop one more portion into the equation, oxygen concentrators. As more and more patients require oxygen support, these are additional technologies that are needed for us to fight COVID, not just the vaccine. Ladies and gentlemen, we've covered the science of vaccines in a quite broad landscape over the last 9.5 minutes or so. Joey, if you please move to the next slide. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the second thing we'll consider is the politics of vaccines. And here I want to concentrate on individual nation states. However, they are defined, countries, nations, states, but we want to consider them as an individual unit within which a lot of policy making takes place. As usual, I'll begin with the context on the left of the screen and then move on to the big picture. We begin with the politics of approval. Approval from the regulatory agencies of the country. In Singapore, it's called the HSA, Health Sciences Authority. In Malaysia, it's called the NPRA. In the US, it's called the FDA, and various other regulatory agencies around the world. In contextual terms, as point number one, vaccine ethics are much more difficult than medicines ethics, because healthy people receive doses in a vaccine rather than sick people. Therefore, the benefit-risk profile changes, and this is a fundamental difference. The second question then that we do, second point or rather, the first question we ask ourselves is, are regulatory agencies insulated from pressure? And we see this in the outgoing President Trump's administration that may have applied a large amount of pressure on FDA in order to approve hydroxychloroquine at some point in the COVID pandemic, and may is alleged to have exerted some pressure on the US FDA during the approval process for the COVID vaccine as well. And if the FDA and the sister agencies in America are subject to such pressure, then it goes to show that the regulatory agencies around the world could also be subject to pressure. This depends on the reporting lines and the structure and the relative strength and political capital of the individual ministries of health, of course. I'll bring a third point to the landscape, that there are reference agencies, such as the US FDA, the European Medicines Authority. These reference agencies often act as, reference agencies for regulatory agencies in countries that do not have the regulatory capacity. And I'm thinking countries in the Middle East, for example, that follow the US, or countries in Africa that might follow US, or even the EMA, or even the UK MHRA. So therefore, the FDA, EMA, and MHRAs of the world will have a lot of global influence and therefore could trigger chain reactions. And this is something for us to be mindful about as well. The fourth element about the politics of approval is the data for approval. Obviously, this is a major exercise in vaccine confidence. The question we should ask ourselves is, how much data is enough? And how do we balance speed and rigor? How do we ascertain the benefit risk profile with limited data? And that these are very difficult conversations, and in every country, they would have the fifth item, which I want to put on everyone's radar, the idea or the concept of an Emergency Use Authorization, or EUA. It has many names. In Singapore, it's called the Pandemic Special Access Route. In Malaysia, it's called the Priority Review, and so on. EUAs, or Emergency Use Authorizations, as was granted to the Pfizer vaccine, does not imply conditional or full registration. There is a subtext over here of countries racing to be the first to approve a vaccine as though it's a matter of national pride. But we'll leave that aside for a second. EUAs are not a substitute for conditional or full approvals, meaning the clinical trials will continue to have to take place, data will continue to need to be collected, and we cannot just pause here and say that, oh, we've got an EUA, therefore we can abandon those clinical trials, we don't have to apply for a conditional or full approval, thinking that an EUA is enough. EUA is for limited, time-limited, and specific users only, rather than as a blanket approval for vaccination of the entire population. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the context of the politics of approval. But we move on to the sharp dilemmas that we have today. And this is about the politics of priorities. In practical terms, in the middle of the screen right now, is who decides who gets the vaccine first? More importantly, or equally importantly, who decides? Who decides, as in who decides the decision makers for who gets the vaccine first? And what are the criteria for prioritization? To take a step back and to be more philosophical in point number two, it's to answer the question, who does society deem important? Do we deem, for example, older people to be more important, or healthcare workers to be more important, or essential workers to be more important, and so on? So the philosophical question goes back to the social contract, which then leads me to my third point. What do we do with non-citizens? And non-citizens is a broad umbrella term. We could have migrants, regular or irregular, documented or undocumented, with refugees, we have stateless people, and we have, shall we say, blue-collar workers or white-collar workers or expatriates, whatever the term might be. I'm not stuck on the term. Let me use the term non-citizens as an umbrella term. Do non-citizens receive the vaccine and in the first stages or the last stages? If it's co-finance with whom? Do we treat them as essential workers, or do we treat them equally as comparable to comparable to citizens of the country in the resident of a nation state? If you're undocumented or an irregular migrant, for example, Malaysia or some other countries will have irregular migrants, do we provide them amnesty as an incentive for them to come forward to be vaccinated, assuming you arrive at all these hurdles? And this has implications of national health security as well as national security as well. To broaden the conversation even more, some countries in Southeast Asia are labor exporting countries. For example, the Philippines and Indonesia. Should labor exporting countries like Philippines or Indonesia or Bangladesh or India vaccinate their citizens abroad? There could be an economic case to be made for it, because X percentage of your GDP could be reliant on the remittances. And if you're reliant on remittances and you want to vaccinate to your citizens abroad, how do we do so? I'm told by some what's the word for diplomatic corps, by some members of the diplomatic corps in Malaysia, that they might return to their home countries in order to receive vaccinations before returning to Malaysia to resume their posting. So what do we do in this particular situation? And finally, in today's dilemmas as well, we must use health economics assessments. What I mean to say is, at some point, countries might need a portfolio of vaccines. We've got 90-something candidates out there. Let's assume 10 of them are ultimately approved. And when you are deciding which of the vaccines to buy with different safety profiles, different price points, different efficacy levels, then you will need health economics or pharmacoeconomics or health technology assessments to help you decide and help you prioritize. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the dilemmas in the politics of priorities today. Let me move on a little bit to the very big picture. Vaccines exist in a health system. Health system exists in different political systems. In Southeast Asia alone, we've got nominally socialist countries, nominally constitutional monarchies, nominally democratic states as well. So my first point in a different political systems of Southeast Asia, for example, or anywhere in the world, is that transparency for vaccines, procurement, and so on is a very political choice. It goes back to the social contract, the political system of a country, even the political economy of a country as well. Transparency from clinical trials and the data of it, to the approval process, especially to the procurement process to make sure that there are no middlemen or intermediaries, the transparency of prioritization, as in who gets the first vaccine and why or why not. And maybe we'll have a situation if you have a portfolio of 3 vaccines from 3 companies, how do you explain to 1/3 of the population that you get vaccine from company A, country A, 1/3 of the population, you get vaccine B from country B, and 1/3 of the population, you get vaccine C from country C? And how do you do all the post-marketing and AEFI, which is adverse events following immunization, and the risk communications attached to all this? There will never be any gold standard. The point I'm making is vaccines will exist in different political systems, which then requires different ways to promote transparency in all the steps that I've outlined. The second point I'll make in the big picture of a vaccine in different political systems is, should you make the vaccine voluntary? Or make it recommended, or make it mandatory? And the third point is, to broaden the conversation even more, should a vaccine more softly, less coercively, be a condition to re-enter public life? For example, Australia has a no jab, no pay policy, where if you do not vaccinate your children, you do not get access to state social security or welfare benefits or any educational benefits, for example. So there is a spectrum of opportunity and ability for the government either to make it just encouraged or recommended, to voluntary, to outright mandatory, with many steps in between. And this depends on the different political systems of the country. The fourth point that I'll make is about vaccine confidence. It is not just vaccine communications and debunking rumors with anti-vaxxers. A lot of very reasonable people in the middle are asking a lot of very reasonable questions about the procurement, the safety, the efficacy, and so on. Therefore, it is a multi-stakeholder effort, not just anti-vaxxers, not just disinformation or misinformation. Vaccine hesitancy needs to be addressed in a multi-stakeholder fashion and must begin today, rather than waiting until the day before the vaccination takes place. And to help vaccine confidence, the fifth and final point that I'll present in the big picture of politics in the nation state level is about product liability. In the UK, the Pfizer's vaccine has been given indemnity, essentially from civil litigation by the UK's government. In effect, if there's any problems that comes up with the administration of the Pfizer vaccine, the UK government will be liable for it. Now, I'm not here to make a judgment good or bad at the moment. Let me present the facts neutrally to all of you. The point I'm making is product liability is important for, well, public confidence reasons, vaccine confidence reasons. Also, it's a reflection of the different political systems that we are in. Ladies and gentlemen, we spent about 10.5 minutes talking about the politics of vaccine in a nation state. I'm ready to move on to the next slide. Joey, please. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the geopolitics slide. This is where we leave the borders of the nation state, and we spend 10 minutes looking at the very broad landscape of the entire world as it relates to the COVID vaccine. As context, we'll begin as usual at the left of the screen in blue. Patents and global public goods have been this perennial debate for decades, if not since, well, for 200 years or something like that, maybe, ever since the idea of a patent came up. But it's taken very sharp focus this year in COVID simply because of the life-saving nature of global public goods. So we begin, number one, with the question, should vaccines be patented? Should we allow compulsory licensing? What about World Trade Organization and the trade-related intellectual property aspects of TRIPS? Responses to the South African and Indian government's request that the COVID vaccine and all the associated technologies surrounding COVID be free from patents so that they can be widely provided to the rest of the world. And you may take sides in this debate, and I certainly take a side in this debate, but let me begin there with the idea that patents and global public goods is a very sharp debate at the moment. Let me proceed by making the second point that vaccine manufacturers, or rather, let me go back 2 steps. In April or May this year, I apologize, in March and April this year, the Chinese government designated ventilators as a national security item. Therefore, exports of ventilators, including to other countries that might be in desperate need for them, was considered, needed to be approved by the Chinese government at one point. Right now, I think the restriction has already been lifted. So I pose a question to all of us. Should vaccine manufacturers be considered national security assets? We want to mobilize their resources, the raw material, the supply chain, put an army guard next to it, and securitize the entire process for good and bad reasons. However, securitization of the pandemic response and global health and public health has pros and cons as well. Let me move on a little bit more to talk about the global public goods element and how there is a sandwich problem. As we raised for vaccines in the global public goods component of it, UMICs, or upper middle income countries, are not poor enough to receive aid in the COVAX facility, for example, yet not rich enough to purchase its vaccines outright. As a fun fact, Canada has already signed agreements with 7 companies, and if all 7 vaccines are approved, Canada will have enough vaccines to vaccinate their population 5 times over. So will not upper middle income countries will not be able to compete in that space, not poor enough to receive aid, not rich enough to purchase outright. So this is a twist on the middle income problem. How do we take care of upper middle income countries? To further the problem, or rather as a partial solution to the problem of the sandwich or middle income trap, do countries need a pandemic production act? This is modeled after the US Defense Production Act. You localize the production, compulsory licensing and patents aside, you mobilize your entire factory or entire manufacturing capacity of a country just to produce COVID technologies. Can you localize production, meaning in a nation state, or regionalize it, for example, Singapore or Malaysia or Thailand, with some domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity, be manufacturing for Southeast Asia, therefore assuring ourselves in Southeast Asia a lot more ability to get the vaccine, leaving aside questions of stockpiling and pooled purchasing, which will drive down prices as well. Finally, in a twist to the idea of global public goods, are social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter and so on considered global public goods if they share vaccine information, which then includes vaccine misinformation and disinformation? That's a part of a separate, much larger debate about the regulation of technology platforms. But ladies and gentlemen, let me end there in the context of patents and global public goods, and I'll move on to the sharp dilemmas facing us today, and that is about nationalism and inequality. The first stocks will go to which countries of the vaccine? The first stocks will go to which countries? This is something disappointingly predictable. The COVAX facility tries to solve this collective action problem, that a pandemic, we're not safe from a pandemic if a pandemic is anywhere in the world. In other words, a pandemic anywhere is a pandemic everywhere. So this collective action problem tries to be the modus operandi or the raison d'etre for the COVAX facility. And yet the COVAX facility has been notably absent from the discussions ever since the vaccine, say, announcements have been made. And it's notably, the vaccine purchases are notably led by countries instead of by the COVAX facility. So that's it about nationalism in my first opening salvo. Then if you have the first stocks going to rich countries, unequal vaccine distribution will only increase global inequality. How? We point to a few examples. Firstly, is to entrench the status quo, which already heavily favors the rich country. Number two, rich countries with more, say, healthier populations will bounce back better, be able to reopen their economies and so on, much earlier than upper middle income countries or low income countries that might only be able to reopen their economies 2 to 3 years from now. These are the two ways in which unequal vaccine distribution can increase global inequality. How do we mitigate this? That is a very difficult question to answer. Perhaps we can leave it for a little bit more of the Q&A. I'll move on a little bit more to talk about nationalism in the sense of superpower rivalries. Let's look at it since the end of the Second World War. We've got the space race to put the first man in space and the first man on the moon and so on. Then the arms race with better nuclear weapons and the asymmetric uses of force. And we're entering right now a vaccine race. Could there be a possibility that the COVID vaccine will become Huawei 2.0, the 5G problem, forcing small countries to choose sides between one superpower that appears to be declining and one superpower that appears to be ascending? And I'm hyper summarizing the situation. Could vaccines be Huawei 2.0, forcing small countries to have to pick sides? Can the COVID vaccine, fourthly, be weaponized either by a state or a non-state actor? A non-state actor could be criminal organizations, terrorist organizations. Let me leave that aside. What about state actors? Could we delay supplies, withhold patents, increase vaccine hesitancy as a tool of foreign policy, either maliciously or unintentionally? And as a fun fact to drive home the point about vaccine inequality, vaccine tourism packages now exist or are currently being marketed. I think that they're quite overly optimistic and quite promising for the top 10%, for the top 1%. And will vaccines be the next Veblen goods, which the desirability of these goods increases the more expensive these goods become? Ladies and gentlemen, these are my thoughts about the nationalism and the inequality element of geopolitics. Allow me 2 more minutes and I'll pass the floor very happily to Professor Mely. It's to talk about the big picture of geopolitics. And we begin with it's talk about the political economy of global health, beginning with the fact that Pfizer and BioNTech's R&D, not the manufacturing element, but the research element, had no public funding. To repeat, they did not rely on NIH money, government money from anywhere in the world. The Pfizer CEO, Albert Bourla, very early on stated that he wanted to move as fast as possible, therefore he will only use Pfizer's money. Is the private sector, therefore, now underwriting public solutions? This is a very difficult question to answer, and the answer will be yes and no. We should examine long-term trends. And if the trend is for private sector underwriting public solutions, it does have implications for the political economy as well as the effectiveness of global health. The alternative to the private underwriting of public solutions is China's state-funded research model and also their state-owned enterprises. Without going into too much detail right now, the world might be having a difficult decision, assuming it's a binary choice. I don't really always believe in binary choices, but assuming it's a binary choice, which is the better model? Or how do we harness the effectiveness of both models and try to come up with a hybrid model, for example, between private underwriting or state-funded research models? I'll move on by saying in the political economy of global health, focusing on the vaccine, but moving a little more broadly, is that neoliberalism has been very strong in the health sector, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Big Pharma, during the vaccine season today, ties purchases to confidential prices and discounts. It's a commercial strategy, which is not great for the people and citizens who are looking to scrutinize these deals. I understand that this is the political economy of global health, but that should not stop citizens and NGOs from raising their concerns in this situation. There could be market-friendly trade treaties like USMCA or the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or the recently signed RCEP for Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific. There is also the specter of an investor-state dispute settlement, ISDS. This is over and above the indemnity that Pfizer currently enjoys from the United Kingdom government. These things affect health. In the United Kingdom during COVID, the United Kingdom privatized COVID testing and tracing. To repeat, what is usually considered a public function was privatized in the United Kingdom for testing and tracing. Will they then privatize the delivery of the COVID vaccine, and will other countries follow suit as well? And this is part of the broader picture of the big question of is there state retreat at the moment happening around the world? And the final two questions, then I'll pass the floor over to Mely, are more future questions. How do we assure that global goods R&D will be protected? The pharma model at the moment is grossly inefficient. We spend billions of dollars and years of research in order to come up with one medicine, but we've proven that a new model of accelerated research can be safe and effective and can work. So maybe we need reforms and also new incentives. The R&D is one component. I will end with how to fund global goods. ADB, or the Asian Development Bank, recently announced a $9 billion COVID vaccine facility. The World Bank in 2017 announced pandemic bonds. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, and the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, has announced a health Silk Road as well. So these are players in the game of the political economy of global and regional health. And I think it's a wonderful place to end. Mely, I've taken 33 minutes. Sorry for the extra few minutes. Let me pass the floor over to you, Mely. Happy to listen to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Swee Kheng, for that very, very comprehensive presentation. I think there's really, really a lot for us to think about, to chew on, and you've covered really quite a wide spectrum of issues, which I think we all need to think about, and perhaps this will be a good opportunity for our audience to raise some questions, because I think for easier way to manage this, if you could just type in your questions in the chat box and I will read them out, and also then ensure that your questions are taken. So I invite questions. I'm not able to, let's not use the raise hand, let's just type it in. In the meantime, okay, so I have one here now, let me see. Right, so first question is from Al Cook. It talks about, he says, you raised the question that if vaccines should be patented. You said you came down on a particular side. So he wants to know, what is your argument in this debate? What is that particular side that you're talking about? Yeah, thank you.
Mely, thank you very much for the question. Al, thank you very much for the question as well. I come down on the side of fewer patents and fewer restrictions to provide the COVID vaccine to the world. That's where I come down on. And that's a broad sketch. Allow me to elaborate in two ways. There's a short-term and there's a long-term way. The long-term way requires a set of reforms because the urgency of the situation warrants that we change the way we finance and provide patents to the COVID vaccine. And that's a very easy case to make in the short term. That doesn't mean that once we get past the pandemic, that we will use the short-term solution in the long term. So long-term systemic reforms are also very crucial. Let me begin with the short term, Al. I come down again on the side of fewer patents and fewer restrictions and more ability for people to get the COVID vaccine. Patents are only one part of the legal problem or the legal determinants of the COVID vaccine, say, landscape. Other things will be manufacturing considerations and also whether or not you will have a tiered pricing. So it remains possible for a company to hold a patent, but to have tiered pricing for, let me just broadly invent three categories of rich, middle income, and low income countries, and they can still keep that patent. So you might not need to abolish all patents for the COVID vaccine, yet you're still able to deliver vaccines in tiered pricing for the various countries in the world. My first commentary in the short term. The second commentary in the short term is you can license you hold a patent, but you license the patent at no cost, no royalties to a group of manufacturers around the world. Because your target market, if you're a farmer, is to make money in North America, Europe, and certain Asian countries, and less in other countries around the world. So if Dr. Reddy Pharmaceuticals, I'm just inventing an example of a real life company. I hold no interest in any pharma companies whatsoever. So a Dr. Reddy or a Chipla or a Serum Institute of India will then take the patent, manufacture it, and then pay no royalties to Pfizer. And that could be another way to do it as well. Thirdly, it's about the patents issue. It could be a fig leaf, rather, a very emotional debate, which is very important, but with a lot of heat rather than light, because manufacturing capacity in various countries might not be able to deal with the complexity of managing an mRNA vaccine. Therefore, even if you give up the patent, if you don't transfer the technology, you will not be able to deliver the vaccine to 8.0 billion people or 8 billion people of the world right now. Those are the considerations of the patent, and I'm highlighting how complex the patent situation is. But do I believe that you need to have fewer patent barriers to providing people more access? Yes, in those three specific short-term solutions, which could buy you more time to have the long-term solution. In a long-term solution, Al, and I'll spend just one more minute on this, it is to reform the entire global patent system, meaning the Intellectual Patent Office, the Patent Office, intellectual property rights, so WTO regime, trade-related intellectual property aspects, including the provisions inside regional trade treaties, will probably have to be rewritten from scratch. There are two ways to look at it. One is incremental reform. The other one is dramatic, revolutionary reform. And at the moment, I think patents, this is the right time for us to have something quite revolutionary, because there's a lot of political will surrounding and backing this particular move. Al, I hope I've given you a bit of the short-term realities of it, also a bit of the long-term. Mely, over to you.
Okay, there are several questions coming in. So what I'll do is I'll try to cluster them, maybe one or two questions at the same time, and let you respond to them, just so that we can cover as much ground as possible. You mentioned earlier on, you raised the question of who should get it, who decides. And one of the questions from Nazra would like your thoughts on whether vaccines should be mandatory for the whole population or just for certain segments, right? Or should this be voluntary? And second is the, the vaccines and travel. So what do you think countries should do in dealing with visitors from countries in which there's low level of trust in vaccines that they are using? I guess if countries, if your country has already been, if population has already been actively vaccinating its own people, what do you do with people traveling from countries that have low vaccination? I think that's the question. And I think I could squeeze in one more. Sorry, it talks about when you order something, this is from Munir Majid from Malaysia. Malaysia has ordered 12.8 doses of Pfizer-BioNTech. Has it obtained approval to be administered already? So 3 questions, right? Okay, Swee Kheng.
Of course. Thank you, Mely. Nazran, thank you for your question. Nazran's question, the first question, is about the intention for your question is, how do we get as many people as possible to be vaccinated? And you provided a few ideas. The first one is mandatory. Do we make it recommended, or do we only make it mandatory for certain parts of the population? Nazran, let me go to the root of your question and propose the following. We have to first have a carve out. The carve out is maybe there's 5 or 10% of the population who can't receive the vaccine. They're allergic to the components. They're perhaps pregnant women for which there is very little data, or they have previous injection site reactions that were quite serious, therefore precluding them from receiving the vaccine. These people exist in any situation or for every vaccine, so we cannot, shall we say, touch them. Yeah, so we have to put them aside, and let me speak about the remaining 90% of the population who should be vaccinated. Let's assume we want to achieve 100% coverage. We should begin with encouraged and recommended and voluntary vaccinations. We should begin there with a good public relations campaign about vaccine confidence. Number 2, Elvis Presley increased the polio vaccination rate from 1% to 60% just by getting vaccinated on live television back in the 1960s, I believe. So we should have public figures are being vaccinated as well. So it's risk communications. It should be visible public leadership. It should be a lot of transparency about the vaccines purchase process, approval process, and so on. That should give people a lot of confidence to be vaccinated. So in the first phase, recommended, encouraged, and voluntary. and then you measure results in, say, 3 months, 6 months time, it will take you a lot of time to even deploy the vaccine. So then you'll be able to gather some information. So in realistic terms, we might not have to make the decision of mandatory vaccinations or no mandatory vaccinations until more data has come in. And if we play our cards right, we never have to make the nuclear decision to impose mandatory vaccinations. So if you want to ask me in a principle, conceptual, and philosophical note, I'm not really in favor of mandatory vaccinations. It can and should be used as a nuclear option in some jurisdictions. I don't think it should be deployed as the first option in any vaccination program of any country, given the logistics that I've already described. Thank you, Nasran. Mely, your second question, if I may move on to it, is let's just say we have country A and country B, and country A wants to allow citizens from country B to come into country A, but they may have received vaccines from a particular country, vaccines that you might not trust, or for any trust is a very fragile commodity, right? So I'll be careful about using that word. So if you are uncertain about, I guess, the health status of any country, then how should you make the decision to allow citizens from country B to travel to country A? That's the question. I will begin by saying that this is a very sensitive topic, fraught with a lot of discrimination, fraught with a lot of perceptions rather than outright data. And you can adjust your risk appetite up or down depending on the politics of the country rather than based entirely on evidence. So this is an extremely delicate, very diplomatically costly, and also ethically fraught problem that we're trying to manage right now. To which I will say the following to directly answer the question after those caveats. Vaccine efficacy is generally comparable between all the currently approved vaccines at the moment. We have a selection of countries. So we've got the US, UK, Russia, and China being the 4 countries that are currently having vaccines that have already been approved by the regulatory agencies. I don't want to comment or make judgments about the effectiveness of each of those vaccines. I will set that aside. What I will instead say is that the effectiveness of the vaccine is only one criteria among a sea of criteria that you need to consider before you lower your borders for citizens of another country. These travel bubbles or travel zones or safe travel zones and so on, right? You cannot only rely on one consideration of the vaccine efficacy and where does the vaccine come from. To rely solely on that one metric means that you're doing a disservice to yourself, to humanity, and also to the neighboring country. Other factors you need to consider: caseloads, cases in the last 14 days, average case fatality in the last 14 days, how robust or reliable or trustworthy, and trustworthy, like I said, differs from country to country and risk appetite to risk appetite. How reliable and robust and trustworthy is a testing system, tracing system, and even the immunity that comes out from the vaccine. Can you really be sure that even with a vaccine of 100% efficacy, that you are truly vaccinated? One time when I was in Africa and I needed a yellow fever vaccination, I was offered the opportunity to pay $10 US to get the card and no vaccination. And that was a very difficult ethical dilemma. I mean, it was easy for me. Obviously, I got the shot, but that ethical dilemma would be very difficult for very many people who might want to travel to see their country, to see their family members in other countries as well. All I'm saying right now is that one criteria alone is probably not enough to make a very difficult decision. And let me pause there. Mely, I'll move on to the third question from Tan Sri Munir Majid. It's a pleasure to have you here, sir. Malaysia has purchased 12.8 million doses from Pfizer, and I think we hope to purchase more. The vaccine is currently not approved by the NPRA, or National Pharmaceutical Regulatory Agency in Malaysia. That does not mean that it will not eventually be approved. It's just that as of today, it's not yet been approved. There are 2 reasons for this. Firstly, the data has not really been submitted to the NPRA. Number 2, the UK Medicines and Health Regulatory Agency, or MHRA, could be the first in the world to approve the Pfizer vaccine because they've had this process called rolling submissions. And they've had data rolling in from Pfizer every 2 months or every 6 weeks for the last 6 months or so. Therefore, they've consistently reviewed the data, allowing them to provide the registration under an emergency use very, very quickly. In Malaysia, not only have we not received the data as of today, we've also not received the data on a rolling basis. And if I make one final note as well, to add on to the richness of my point about emergency use authorization, in Malaysia, the process is called priority review. In different countries, they're called different things as well. To the best of my knowledge, EUAs, or emergency use authorizations, are very rarely, if at all, used for vaccines. because vaccines have a different safety profile. Like I mentioned, they're given to healthy adults, not sick adults. Therefore, the risk benefit and the benefit risk profile are very, very different calculations. Those are my three answers to the three questions. Over to you, Mely.
Okay, thank you, Swee Kheng. Swee Kheng, we have questions related to the point about access, right? So one from Soon Kiat, it says, with Singapore's announcement that it had approved and secured Pfizer vaccines, with the first shipment being delivered by the end of the month, do you think rich city-states, or rich countries for that matter, not just Singapore, has added to the problem of unequal vaccine distribution, right? And second, which is again related to that, is what can be done to help other countries in getting enough vaccines? So any role for regional organizations like ASEAN? This is from Lina Gong from RSIS. And again, related to that is when you talk about the WHO-led COVAX facility, there's a question here about asking you to say more about what this COVAX facility is. And just get that right. Does it actually help, right? Because I believe that was the whole purpose of having this COVAX Act Accelerator program. It's also to allow for other partners to come in, sign in, so that they will have access to vaccines at affordable prices. So maybe we can, cluster these three questions together. So okay, yeah.
Thank you, Mely. Again, I'll begin with Soon Kiat's question, which is about Singapore's purchase of Pfizer's vaccine. Let's assume for 5 million people, although I do not know the actual number, but let's assume for 5 million people. Does it contribute to the problem of unequal vaccine distribution, therefore global inequality? Soon Kiat, great question. The answer is yes and no. It contributes and it doesn't contribute. It contributes in conceptual, academic, and theoretical terms. I agree. And I don't have much more to add beyond what I've just said. Let me set that aside. But perhaps in Singapore's case, or let me invent a second example, Hong Kong with 7 million people, or Qatar with less than 1 million, or the UAE with approximately 7 million. These are small, rich city-states. In UAE is not a city, I get that. But I'm talking about smaller countries with fewer people, but are very rich, for example. Do they really contribute to vaccine inequality? Yes, in conceptual terms, but perhaps no, in two ways. Because it remains a duty of a government to protect its citizens as best as they can. The legitimacy or the performance legitimacy or the output legitimacy of each of these governments rely on them protecting their citizens, taxpayers, and voters to the best of their ability. So one cannot fault the Singaporean government or the Qatari government or the San Marino or Monaco or Hong Kong government for purchasing these vaccines for their own citizens. The second analysis that I will share over here is that in practical terms, a relatively small city set of 5 million people will probably not contribute meaningfully to global inequality. I have great respect for Singapore. 5 million people will probably not move the needle. But if 300 million Americans were to purchase a vaccine aggressively, and there's an America First policy and us before anyone else, and so on, and 300 million people just by sheer volume alone will probably contribute a lot more to global inequality in terms of vaccine distribution. So Soon Kiat, my answer is a yes and no with the analysis that I've just provided to you. Allow me to move on to the second question, which is Lina's question about regional organizations and what we can do. And I'll talk about ASEAN, and then I'll talk about the Pan-American Health Organization, PAHO, which is in America. First about ASEAN. What can we do in ASEAN? Two things. The first, maybe three things actually. The first one is pool procurement. The second one is regionalizing our manufacturing so that we assure the supplies for the entire Southeast Asia region. And thirdly, stockpiling. As a result of pool procurement as well as a regional manufacturing. So the pool procurement is reasonably straightforward. Singapore, for example, has 5 million people, Malaysia has 32, but ASEAN has, Southeast Asia has 650 million people with a 3-4 trillion US dollar economy. That is a lot of purchasing power. And when we organize ourselves as a purchasing block, manufacturers will be more likely to put us front of the queue because there is something called MOQ in the pharma world, minimum order quantity. for which they'll be happy to open up the factories and put you front of the queue. So Malaysia, for example, with 30 million people, or even Brunei with 400,000 people, will find it a bit difficult to go to the front of the queue unless you pay a lot of money. So there are very many advantages to pool procurement in terms of purchasing power, in terms of putting yourself front of the queue. And I'll add one more: transparency, because it's much more difficult to hide say middleman deals and so on and so forth. But if there's pool procurement between all the countries of Southeast Asia, so that's one thing that ASEAN can do, or Southeast Asia can do. Who can lead this? Potentially the ASEAN Secretariat, or any country. Indeed, the health infrastructure in the ASEAN Secretariat is currently led by Vietnam, also with a rotating chairmanship. But Thailand is also a very good candidate to lead this, because they host the ASEAN +3 with China, Japan, and South Korea. ASEAN +3 Universal Health Coverage Network in the Ministry of Public Health in Thailand, and 2 universities in Thailand as well. So the Thai government could also be providing leadership in pool procurement. Number 2 is regional manufacturing. Based on the models that I've described, either you localize the industries, or you operate as a joint venture with some technology transfers, or you in-license the product and the patents in Southeast Asia, and then you rapidly ramp up your manufacturing capacity. Malaysia has some simple fill and finish for vaccines. Singapore has more advanced production of a highly active pharmaceutical ingredients, or HAPI, or highly active vaccine ingredients, HAVI, and there could be some sort of a collaboration between these two countries in order to produce enough vaccines for Southeast Asia. That's the second thing that ASEAN or regional entities can do. Thirdly is a stockpile, and I'm thinking not just a vaccine stockpile, but I'm thinking of a stockpile of personal protective equipment, masks, ventilators, and so on. Pre-positioning, I'm just inventing over here, 4 locations, 2 in Indochina, perhaps one in Thailand, Myanmar, the other one in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and another one, one for the Philippines and the Borneo states of Sabah, for example. We could base that in Manila, and one more in the eastern part, the southern part of Southeast Asia, maybe based in Jakarta or just outside Jakarta to Yogyakarta, perhaps. And these 4 sites, just off the top of my head, will be geographically dispersed so that if any natural disasters were to hit, we will still be able to mobilize 3 other sites to produce ventilators, face masks, personal protective equipment, gloves, and so on, including stockpiles of the vaccine and or any emergency essential drugs that will be part of the essential drugs list of the World Health Organization. Lina, those are my thoughts, very specific and granular thoughts about how ASEAN can do more. Let me take you to the Western Hemisphere, to PAHO. The World Health Organization has 6 regional offices. PAHO or PAHO is the Pan American Health Organization. It encompasses Canada all the way down to Chile and Argentina. So that's a Pan American organization. They have something called a revolving fund. It's capital R and capital F. It's a fascinating concept. The PAHO revolving fund essentially is capitalized by the countries in PAHO. They capitalize the fund. They will use the interest rates of the capital to purchase whatever items they might need, either for emergency purposes or for routine purposes. And if they do draw down from the capital, they will then replenish it again. And it revolves. It revolves because there's already a built-in formula within the budgets of national governments and a pre-existing sometimes international treaty, sometimes a historical inertia sort of arrangement to continually replenish the revolving fund of PAHO. No other WHO region has that. Southeast Asia has one more structural problem. We have 10 countries in ASEAN. 3 of those countries belong to the Southeast Asia Regional Office, which is headquartered in Delhi. The WHO region, SEARO or CRO, is headquartered in Delhi. It contains India and the Indian Ocean states, including Pakistan. And the 7 remaining countries are with the Western Pacific Regional Office, which contains Australia, Japan, China, and South Korea as well, and that's based in Manila. Indonesia, Myanmar, and Thailand report to Delhi. The remaining 7 countries in Southeast Asia report to Manila. And that makes it very difficult for the Southeast Asia geography to interact with the WHO regions, which means that if anybody's going to set up a revolving fund, it has to be the ASEAN Secretariat. That's my answer to Lina, and sorry for a pretty long one. Allow me to move on to the third question from Mely, which is about the COVAX facility. Thank you, Tan Sri Munir, for another great question. The COVAX facility is one of 4 arms of the ACT Accelerator. The ACT Accelerator is the umbrella. It has 4 arms to research and fund COVID testing, like test kits. Number 2, treatments for COVID. Number 3, vaccines for COVID. And number 4, a health system integrator to connect the three technologies. So it's test, treatments, and vaccines, and a health systems connector to connect all of them. The COVAX facility is a vaccine arm, and it's led by Gavi, which does a lot of vaccine work around the world. What the COVAX facility tries to do is to solve the collective action problem, which a United Nations framework has failed to solve all these years. And it's emergency stopgap measure only for the COVID pandemic, and is designed to rapidly accelerate the production of vaccines, and then to crash research, crash manufacture, and crash distribute the vaccine. The research right now, they have 9 candidates in the, shall we call them list 1, and another 18 or 20 candidates in list 2. List 1 is more promising. They will sign agreements with Pfizer and the likes of them in order to purchase those vaccines once they've been approved. So crash research is 1, crash manufacturing is a 2nd, and COVAX is now also providing seed capital to companies and factories in India and China in order to manufacture these vaccines at large scale. And then thirdly, to distribute. And this is where it gets political. The distribution for COVAX envisages that 20% of all the population of all COVAX countries will receive it in phase 1. And then in progressive allotments for all countries. So it's like 20% first, and then 30%, and then 40%, and then 50% for all countries that have signed up to COVAX. But there are 2 major problems with COVAX. Firstly, not all countries are in it. And the US and China held out for a long time before they entered COVAX. And frankly, to this day, I'm not really certain whether or not the United States is truly in COVAX or not. Rhetoric is there, but there are no signed legal instruments at the moment. I'm happy to be corrected. And perhaps when President Joe Biden comes into power on the 20th of January, after he enters the Paris Agreement, maybe he'll enter the COVAX facility next. But let me set that aside, that not all countries are in COVAX. COVAX has a second problem of a funding gap. They want 38 billion US. They only have 3 billion US, and there's still 35 billion US as a gap at the moment. And that gap for the entire ACT Accelerator, that gap of 35 billion is disappointing, but also very predictable, because the world remains organized in nation states that compete with one another to protect its own citizens. And until there is a very strong United Nations Security Council resolution to support COVAX, we might not see a very successful COVAX. And case in point is all the vaccine deals that have been announced with Pfizer have mostly been or all been with countries rather than with COVAX. And again, if something escapes my radar, I'm happy to be corrected. And maybe there's a lot of background negotiations that are taking place without our visibility, in which case I apologize one more time. But then again, if we go back to an understanding of how the world is arranged in nation states, this probably doesn't surprise us as well. So those are the 3 challenges with COVAX. Firstly, not all countries are there. Number 2, there's a funding gap that's quite large. And number 3, the world remains organized along nation states that still compete with one another for advantage, and in this case, to protect their own citizens. Thank you, Tan Sri Munir. Mely, over to you.
Yes, okay, so there are a lot more questions, but I thought this question on governance is a good issue. There are 2 questions related to this. One is the role of the WHO. From Richard, it says, we have seen during COVID-19 how the WHO is being accused of failing to lead, and is also caught in the politics between the US and China, where the US even threatened to stop its funding to the WHO. What do you think about the role that the WHO could have played better moving forward, especially in ensuring health as a public good is safeguarded globally? So the role of the WHO is, and the other one is another interesting question. It's about the use of resources. From Moses Raj, this question is health governance flexibility in resource allocation for current health issues faced by the population without jeopardizing resource allocations for other ongoing health issues. Because there's always this thing about, the fear that the other communicable diseases, they will get less attention because everything is focused on COVAX. So how efficient is this flexibility, be it regionally or globally, based on the current COVID-19 situation? So I thought I'll put that together for you to respond. And that's on the governance side. And the other one is really on risk. I think you have mentioned this earlier, but since people have raised this, the risk to let me read that question properly. It says, sorry, I'm having okay, about the elderly. Okay, so I'm finding it hard to look at the questions from here. So I'm sorry, Swee Kheng, can you just respond to the two questions on governance first while I sort these out? Thank you. Yeah.
Of course, Mely.
Yeah.
Mely and all attendees, thank you very much for your time. I will keep my answers shorter so that we can maximize the rest of it. There seems to be a lot of great questions out there. So
Yeah.
I'll keep my answers shorter right now and less comprehensive with my apologies, yeah? Richard, firstly, let's begin with you. Thank you for your question, Richard. And your question is about what can the WHO done better? This is a great question. Lots of people have tried to answer it. And I might point you to an excellent report written by the Council on Foreign Relations about how the WHO could have responded better during this pandemic as well. Secondly, there will be an upcoming report by the Independent Panel for Pandemic Responses, or IPPR, that was convened and is led by two people, Dame Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, and Dame Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former President, I think, of Liberia. And these two ladies are tasked with an independent review of what the WHO could have done better. And I think they'll do a far better job about explaining this than I would be able to in just 1 minute, Richard. But I will make, however, one comment though. There will be an almost endless list of what the WHO can do better, almost endless list. Let me make an excuse for the WHO. I'll defend them. I'll defend them by saying that it is not, the WHO is not set up and financially and politically capitalized, so organization-wise, finances-wise, and political capital-wise, to be a global coordinator of a pandemic response that still relies largely on competition between nation states and also nation state responses. What I mean to say is when the US pulled out, they pulled out 15% of their funding. It will be reinstated, which is great. Leaving 4 of the top 10 funders in the WHO being non-governments, meaning Gates Foundation and so on, and Gavi and so on, are funding the World Health Organization. That has got knock-on consequences of, say, accountability. I mean, who holds a billionaire accountable? Though I love the Gates Foundation, I think they do excellent work. It raises issues of how do we govern the accountability of the people who provide the funding in the first place. So there are very many questions about the organization structure, the quantum of funding and the who funds them, and also whether or not they have they as in the WHO have the political capital to be this world savior that we want them to be. And the WHO, frankly, is only a symptom of the, shall we say, broader challenge of global governance. If the United Nations Security Council cannot do X number of things, we cannot solve nuclear non-proliferation, we cannot even have an accord on the Paris Agreement for climate change, we cannot solve intractable problems like Israel and Palestine, for example, without going into any more sensitive topics. I just give 3 examples of how the global system is probably in need of some strengthening, repair, reform, however you choose to describe it. WHO is one part of the global governance framework. Richard, that's me answering the question by saying that there's an endless list, but also making a bit of an excuse or defending the World Health Organization at the moment. Let me move on to Moses's point, Richard, with your permission. Moses, thank you for your question. Moses is a great one. Moses's question is about, you've got COVID and you need to spend money on COVID. How do you spend money on COVID without compromising the allocations to other areas of healthcare and other areas of social development as well? And I'll make a few comments over here, starting with the fact that in the OECD countries, 10% of federal government expenditure, or even total government expenditure, approximately 10%, is spent on health. Now, who is to say that it should be 20% or 30% or 40%? Because when you spend 20% on health, then something's got to give, unless you dramatically expand your tax base. So I would say 10% health spending as a percentage of a federal government expenditure or total government expenditure appears to be a reasonable number. The second point I'll make is, during the resource allocation problems of COVID, one easy structural solution is to expand the amount of funding available to health. That way you can deploy more to COVID and not compromise routine care like diabetes and cancers and surgeries and childbirth and maternal health, for example. All those things can remain funded if you expand the funding to healthcare as a whole. Thirdly and finally, I will say the following in terms of resource allocation. So you have a larger pie, obviously. If you have a larger pie and you devote some of it to non-health care spending, I'll be happy. So if you give me $1 billion to spend, I might not spend $1 billion to build more hospitals or to buy more vaccines. It's a great purchase. I'm not saying it's a bad purchase. What I might also do with $1 billion extra is to look at the social determinants of health. At some point, deaths from COVID might be overtaken by deaths from the effects of economic deprivation, loss of livelihoods, mental health, and even prolonged isolation, economic disrepair of a country, and so on. Obviously, a lot of people have passed away from COVID, and I'm not suggesting that the economic outcomes will be much worse than that, and certainly I hope not. The point I'm making is that if you devote $1 billion to the social determinants of health, not doctors, not hospitals, not vaccines, but to help people recover economically, socially, mentally, and psychologically, I would consider that to be money well spent as well. That's me opening up the size of the pie, having a larger pie, but not being totally selfish about having a much larger size of the pie. For me, I want a larger pie for sure, a reasonable amount for health, and everything else can be also to the non-healthcare elements of health. Mely, over to you.
Okay, so there were a couple of questions back to the issue of risk. One here from Hon Kwan. It says, all vaccines have different degree of side effects or risk, including, of course, COVID-19. So the emphasis of its side effects or risk will deter people from vaccination. So for example, the elderly worry about the side effects, but they themselves are the high-risk group that needs to be protected. So the question is, how do we therefore address this paradox? You know, people being afraid, but then they're the ones that need to be protected. The other one, I think you have mentioned it, you've already talked about it, but since it's been here, it's about if children and pregnant women are not, are not part of the population, the group that you cannot vaccinate, how do you keep them safe, I think, from COVID? Because the question is, how do you keep them safe from vaccines or something like that? But I think the question essentially is, if they're excluded because of the risk, how do you keep them safe? So let's put that, cluster that together. And the other one, since we can put that as one and then one more, I'm just trying to rearrange it so we can cover as much ground as possible, is the role. He's somebody from this group that talks about, what do you think about the role of the military in distribution of vaccines? This is from Charlie, from Bose Allen Hamilton. You know, how important will the militaries with their logistics capabilities be in vaccine distribution? So let's talk about the risk and again the distribution. Two questions and one on the role of the military. Swee Kheng?
Thank you, Mely. These are great questions. I'll begin with Hon Kwan's questions about the paradox of risk. You need the vaccine to protect yourself, but you may suffer higher side effects as well. So I'll begin with the fact that side effects, even in the old population, in the Pfizer trial at least, which I'm most familiar with because a lot more data has come out on it, is very low. So this is reassuring to older people that side effects, although present, are low and minimal and quite easily dealt with. There have been some deaths, but the deaths are not related to the vaccine itself. Let me repeat, the deaths are not related to the vaccine. So that's an important fact, right? That there are side effects, but they are predictable and they're low, and it doesn't seem to be very, very harmful or fatal to the old people. That's an important fact. I'll move on by saying two more points, and then I'll move on to the next question, Hon Kwan. The second point that I'll make is structural. The third point that I'll make is personal. The structural one is to have a risk communications and vaccine confidence plan that begins today, day zero, rather than waiting for the day just before the person is going to get the vaccination. And to raise vaccine confidence, it would be to have things like, this is why we procured from this company, this is a safety profile, this is the price that we paid, and so on and so forth. And we continue collecting data, including what happens after the vaccination, to provide them the reassurance that if you have a side effect after you receive the vaccine, we will be there to catch you if you fall. And that kind of risk communications needs to happen from day zero all the way to maybe 2 weeks after the second dose of the vaccination, to make sure that everybody feels very safe. This is a feeling, because the first point I made to you is a rational thought, a fact. But we also have to manage people's feelings, which is also very important in risk communications in public health. The third and final point, Hon Kwan, is personal, at the personal level. So I've described the systems, right? You know, a very broad picture, how it translates into policies and so on and so forth. But at the personal level, trust between the elderly person and the person who is delivering the vaccine is important. So I might say, if you go to a GP that you trust, I will go to that GP and provide resources for the GP to communicate that information about the vaccine to the older person. The point I'm making is I'm leveraging on existing trusting relationships, and I'm going personal to the neighborhood doctor or to the nurse that you know for a long time, and to use various channels to communicate information, rational, realistic, and clear, irrefutable facts to you through media and people that you understand and appreciate and trust. Those are my 3 thoughts, Hong Kwan. Allow me to move on to the question about children and pregnant women. We'll separate them into 2. Children, data for children and vaccines, COVID vaccines in children, data for that is increasing. So Pfizer's emergency use in the US is for 16 and above. But today, they're already conducting trials for children as young as approximately 6 to 8 years old. And it will probably be only a matter of time until we can get children, perhaps as young, I'm just inventing on the basis of no evidence. I repeat, on the basis of no evidence, potentially getting children as young as maybe a newborn or something like that to be vaccinated, because certain vaccinations are already delivered at birth. But that bridge will probably take 1, 2, 3, 4 years maybe for us to get that comfortable. Until that time, the concept of herd immunity could come in, and if we have the vaccine and we achieve a good coverage of, I'm inventing a number, 70 to 90% with non-pharmaceutical interventions, with appropriate social distancing and hand hygiene and various other, say, non-pharmaceutical interventions, we should be able to protect the most vulnerable population who cannot be vaccinated simply because data doesn't exist. That's for children. For pregnant women, the same principle applies as well, but with a few exceptions and twists. Maybe if COVID becomes endemic, we will maybe upgrade it from encouraged to recommended, or from recommended to maybe even mandatory for those thinking about getting pregnant to be vaccinated with the COVID vaccine, and then prove that you've got the antibody titers and you're protected from COVID before you are free or are safe to get vaccinated. Now, by no means am I suggesting that this should be the case. I'm merely presenting a possibility which needs to be studied by gynecologists, scientists, and immunologists, also by ethicists and legal specialists to come up with something like this. Yeah. So by no means am I suggesting that this is the right move. I think more study is needed. That's the question for children and pregnant women. Allow me to move to the third and final question for now, which is the military. This is a fascinating question. So thank you for that, Charlie. I'll respond in a few ways. The first one is the logistics capability of the military. Secondly, the role of the military in the society itself, including elements of trust. And thirdly, the unintended consequences that comes out from it. The military firstly has a lot of logistics. They, for example, in Singapore, where the Civil Defense Force together with the Singapore Armed Forces are very integrated, right? So we can use the security agencies to provide not only logistics and freezers, but also trained personnel and the discipline needed to mount a nationwide program for immunization. So clearly the logistics makes a lot of sense. Secondly, you must consider, or we must consider, the traditional role of the military in that country. For example, do militaries generally stay in the barracks, soldiers in barracks? And soldiers delivering immunization could be strengthening trust or depleting trust in the community. And this depends on community to community. I would even say target community in a neighborhood level, or maybe even ethnic groups, or maybe if you send the military to deploy the military to vaccinate the migrants will run away, for example, right? So it depends on the target population and how the military is being perceived in that particular country, as well as the role of militaries in well, the politics of the country and the delivery of public services, the maintenance of public order, and these things depend from country to country. One more consideration. Thirdly and finally is the unintended consequences of utilizing the military's resources, even if you make the decision that the benefits outweigh the risk. And I would argue that there will be some unintended consequences. For example, the military's role then encroaches quite neatly into civilian life. And vaccinations have always been a civilian activity rather than a military activity. The last time we got the military involved in vaccination, it was to get a doctor into the compound in Abbottabad in Pakistan when Osama bin Laden was assassinated as a result of an intel that was derived from a doctor who used the excuse of vaccination to get into the compound, setting back the vaccination landscape in Pakistan back by several years, decades. I don't know how you quantify these things, but there could be unintended consequences as well. Let me set all that aside. I think there are some good advantages to getting the military involved, especially in a country with fewer public services and less trust in public services. The cohesion, the discipline, the logistics, and the effectiveness of the military is crucial, especially in resource-limited settings. As a small example, when I worked in countries like Cambodia or Nepal, where the institutions are a bit more fragile, the military is often the most effective humanitarian actor. So in these situations, the military will be effective. In other situations, less so, especially if there are unintended consequences. What a fascinating question. Thank you. Mely, over to you.
Yeah, I guess also with the distribution, there's a question here from Marjorie Ong. It says, if you were the decision maker, a decision maker for a nation with the mimic demography of Malaysia and Singapore, how will you act with regards to the mechanism of vaccination, delivery, or policy, respectively? I think you can answer it any way you want.
Thank you, Mely. Mely, may I bring Professor Lokman Hakim's question onto the table as well? And allow me to read very briefly. Prof. Lokman mentions the challenge of communicating with vaccine recipients, especially when you have several vaccines to choose from. Then you've got the untested technologies, the more tested technologies of inactivated vaccines, and so on. What do we do about personal choice? Good on one hand, on the other hand, it's got huge logistics attached to it. So if I can merge these two questions together, the first one about delivery and policy, the second one about personal choice. Thank you for both of you for your questions. As I merge the answers together, I might come up with something that looks like this. We begin with the understanding that healthcare is paternalistic. That doctors often prescribe a treatment to a patient, and the patient is expected to follow that treatment. Because there's an asymmetry of information, there's a principal agent problem at play over here. These are economics principles. Paternalism in healthcare extends beyond the doctors, also to nurses and speech therapists and audiologists and so on and so forth. Not because health professionals know better, that's not what I'm implying, but it is also true that the health professionals have trained a long period of time to get to the knowledge that they have. Plus, in the era of COVID, there is a public duty of health professionals to persuade their patients to take the best possible option at that time. So I'll begin with the conflicts or the dilemmas of paternalism within healthcare. Let me move on to make a second comment over here in terms of vaccine delivery that has a little bit of personal choice. And that personal choice could be less the type of vaccine that you receive, but more about when you receive the vaccine. And I think providing citizens a bit of choice makes them feel that they are part of the process. And in providing them a little bit of choice, and if we limit them to the timing of the vaccination, for example, Monday this week versus Monday next week, for example, not Monday this week versus Monday 2 years from now. I don't think we should give them such a large window, but we provide them a bit of choice for them to be able to feel more empowered and more in control. But not only do we provide them a bit of choice in terms of the timing, maybe a bit more choice in terms of who should be the first people to get the vaccines. My comments about delivery and logistics and getting private sector and trusted doctors involved, I've already made that and I will not repeat them. I'll make one additional comment over here about the decision makers for who gets the vaccine. What I mean to say is, in different countries, they prioritize differently. The UK has now said that frontline health workers and senior citizens should be involved. In America, senior citizens should get it first. In Malaysia, it's frontline health workers first. And different permutations are possible in different countries, given the different epidemiological situations. Why shouldn't the citizen get involved in choosing who should get the vaccine first? Because as I reflect on the question of societies deciding on who is most important to you, why should a small group of decision makers in a smoke-filled, windowless room somewhere buried in the technocratic halls of government get to decide for the importance that society places on different communities? So if there's some sort of a, I wouldn't say a plebiscite or a referendum or a vote, I'm not suggesting any of those, but some mechanism at least to obtain public feedback, that is a strong and very powerful element of personal choice, which I think will be adding on to the mechanisms of delivery and policy that I've already described in this session, and also partially answers Professor Lokman's excellent question about personal choice. We should less about the type of vaccine and perhaps more about who gets to receive it first. Mely, over to you.
Thank you. I think we have covered most of the questions, but I have a question to you, if I may. When you talk about the politics of, well, it doesn't have to be on the vaccine, but just on how countries in the region can work together. And when you have certain countries already, like Singapore, are getting access to vaccines, and other countries, just it's a matter of time that they will get it, but very short time. And the others will take a longer time, right? So in the meantime, the economies are suffering. So there's a lot of talk about getting the region to think about a common travel protocol and health protocol. So, and I think you can relate that to, in view of the fact that although vaccines are there, but it will take time, but at the same time, you also want travel and tourism to revive, and not to mention the fact that people really need to, some people are stuck. So from your point of view, what do you think about the need to have common travel and health protocol, at least within the 10 ASEAN countries?
Mely, it's a great question. Very supportive of a regional travel zone. Let me call it a green zone, between Southeast Asian countries. Maybe 2 or 3 countries can start. It could be bilateral first and then trilateral, and then we'll bring more people in whenever we meet a set of minimum standards. There are problems with a vaccine getting you an immunity passport and then worsening inequality. But this causal link is clear to people. Let me set that aside in favor of a few specific steps that we can take in order to get the travel zone together. Firstly, we're going to start bilateral rather than ambitiously 10 countries all at once. So it could be Malaysia and Singapore first, and we do it well, like the reciprocal green lane, the RGL and the PCA agreement between Malaysia and Singapore, and then we could expand it to Brunei and then certain parts of Indonesia and so on and so forth. Number one. Number two, a mutually agreed upon set of epidemiological criteria. Example, cases in the last 14 days, or new cases in the last 14 days, or percentage positive cases out of 100 COVID tests that you had in the last 14 days, for example, and mutual exchange of information, and very transparently so as well. Number three, some ways to ensure the robustness and accuracy and the reliability of the information. Number four, everybody loves the word blockchain, so I'll use that too. A QR code proposed by President Xi Jinping previously to allow travel. A SWIFT code, there's a SWIFT interbank transfer system, right? Where we transfer money from one bank to another. If we can bring that system into the laboratory system, so you go to a path lab in Singapore, you know that, and they give you a code, and it allows you to travel to Malaysia, and you trust that code because you know it comes from a reputable and trustworthy lab in Singapore. And we extend that network of mutual recognition and some form of regulatory harmonization across the Southeast Asia region. Those are the necessary steps that might need to be taken. Indeed, I've written something about this before, so maybe I'll talk to you, Mely, about how we can get this updated by RSIS, and we can publish it together as well. So let me pause that with an answer.
Okay, so I think we have the last question. We have about 3 minutes left. What do you think about the vaccine fitting into the narrative of the Tokyo Olympic Games? Should a vaccine be compulsory for athletes and officials? And how would they be able to get access to a vaccine coming from different countries?
What a beautiful question, Mely. Mely, allow me to answer it 1 minute, and then if it's okay, can I ask Joey to share the last slide, and then happy for you to close, yeah? So we'll spend the last few minutes like this. Ladies and gentlemen, not on the slide yet. I would like to answer Jovina's question about the Tokyo Olympics. Jovina, I don't know. That's my answer to you. I don't know how we'll get the vaccine. Should we even have the Tokyo Olympics? Should we vaccinate the athletes before they get there? I can see, say, both sides to the situation. So my short answer to you is I don't know. And maybe this is a subject of a longer conversation or a future webinar, but I might end with a thought. Let's assume we get the logistics out of the way, the ethics out of the way, and we get the vaccination passports, immunity passports, and all that. We get that all that out of the way, right? There is a piece of poetry that I want to leave you with, Jovina, and everyone else. The world, all of humanity, Homo sapiens, 7.8 billion of us, we need a bit of a piece of good news. And sports provides a way to unite the world and provide good news as well. So leaving aside the logistics of it and the ethics of it all, assuming the Tokyo Olympics is successful next year with a combination of ways to protect the safety of everyone concerned, vaccines is only one part of the jigsaw puzzle, that will be a pretty fantastic Homo sapiens achievement, and I think the world can tune in and maybe feel a sense of unity one more time. That's not really answering your question, Jovina. My answer is I don't know, but I thought to end with a bit of poetry. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to focus your attention one more time on the screen in front of you. What we did not cover today are on the screen right now. So I'll run through them very briefly and pass it over to Mely. In the science component in blue on the left, we haven't really spoken about how to reform the pharma research model. We've also not spoken about how to reform the academic publishing system to make the incentives more sustainable and the results more accurate. There's been a tsunami of information and papers about COVID. How do we make sense of them? And how do we improve trust in science that's eroding in a post-truth world? And that's not covered today in the science component. We haven't covered in the politics component whether or not vaccines are a human right, whether or not the pandemic today is a stress test, not only for banks, but also for drug regulators. Are they too important to fail? How does populism threaten or even strengthen public health and vaccine confidence? And how does the government prevent vaccine crimes like fraud and counterfeits and black markets and parallel trading? In the world of geopolitics, we did not cover today the role of India as a supplier of last resort. They make 60% of the world's vaccines. How do we manage vaccine diplomacy with a country or a country that uses health as a tool of foreign policy? Benign, malign, I offer no judgments at the moment. How do we manage vaccine diplomacy there? And finally, we've got the COVAX facility and ACT Accelerator and some platforms that came up this year. How do we strengthen these platforms, but also embed them into existing frameworks so that they don't go off and create a United Nations 2.0 or a WHO 2.0 or a governance framework 2.0, whatever you call it. We've covered a lot of ground today, and I'm very pleased to be here with you today. Thank you very much for your time. Mely, over to you.
Thank you, Swee Kheng. I think the rest of the audience can join me in really thanking you for such a comprehensive presentation. I think the last slide that you showed us only reinforces the fact that we're just beginning to scratch the surface in this whole issue of public health, dealing with pandemics and vaccines. And obviously there's a long list of items that you want to discuss, and you need to slice them further. And I suppose different communities of practice and different scholars from where they are can look at this issue separately. So what it means is that there's a vast field out there that needs to be explored further. But one thing is for sure, the pandemic, the paradox is that it has actually made people, it's bad news, but the good news is that it's made people more aware about the importance of public health. And that public health is no longer just, the domain of scientists, but of politicians, of the private sector, civil society groups, and as you say, the humanity at large. So it's exactly 5:01. I think we can bring this webinar to the close. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure chairing this session. I'm sure the rest of the people who have joined us really found this very, very interesting and very stimulating. Once again, thank you and enjoy your evening.